On March 17, 1982, as Springsdale started revealing the secrets of the harsh winter within the Ozark Hills in Missouri, a social assistant named Margaret Wilson visited an isolated cabin inside Shannon County. What she discovered would forever alter her understanding of the limits of social isolation and the results of institutional neglect in rural American communities. The Sheltons' property was 27 kilometers from Current River, the nearest city. It was accessible only via a dirt road that became impassable during the spring rains. For over 3 decades, the family lived virtually without contact with the exterior world. An anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, claiming children were living in unhealthy conditions and possibly suffering abuse, motivated Margaret's visit. Arriving at the property, Margaret was met by Elijah Shelton, 47, a man of medium stature, a gray beard, and intense blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of generations of isolation. In the cabin, Elijah lived with his sister Martha Shelton, 43, and 3 children, Thomas, 12, Sadie, 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years old. The cabin, which Elijah's grandfather built in the 1920s, was a wooden structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. The property had a small barn, a vegetable garden, and a well. There was no piped water or electricity. The isolation was nearly total, with occasional trips into town to purchase supplies they could not produce. That day the climate was mild, with a temperature of 17 degrees C and partially cloudy skies. The recent defrosting had left the ground around the cabin muddy, and the air carried the characteristic smell of wetland and decaying wood. During her initial inspection, Margaret observed that the children showed signs of light malnutrition and a lack of basic medical care. Thomas had a badly healed scar on his right arm, resulting from an axe accident the year before. Sadie had a light strabismus that had never been treated. Jacob, the youngest, showed signs of cognitive development delay for his age. What captured Margaret's attention, however, were the physical similarities between the 2 adults and the children. They all shared striking features: the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone structure, the same ear shape, characteristics that suggested not just kinship but also very close consanguinity. When asked about the mother of the children, Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering that his wife had died during Jacob's delivery. Martha remained silent, avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was at this moment that Margaret started to suspect the story made no sense. County records found no wedding certificate for Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only documents found were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, children of Harold and Edith Shelton, and a land ownership record dated 1924. There were no official birth certificates for the children. The Shelton family gradually isolated themselves after the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a 1973 fire. Since that time, the siblings cut almost all bonds with the local community, only visiting the city for basic needs. Residents of Current River described Elijah as a reserved, suspicious man who avoided prolonged interactions. The first suspicions that Martha might be the children's biological mother started to form in Margaret's mind as she observed the family dynamics. The way Jacob clung to Martha's skirts, how she intuitively knew each child's needs, and how her gaze revealed a deep maternal bond going beyond an aunt's. If you want to follow more cases like this that shake society as a whole and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The formal investigation into the Shelton case started on March 24, 1982, 1 week after Margaret Wilson's initial visit. The Missouri Department of Social Services, in conjunction with the Shannon County Sheriff, dispatched a team to evaluate the situation. This team consisted of Margaret, policeman David Tanner, and Dr. Robert Hayes, a pediatrician. The first obstacle the team encountered was Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origin, he became defensive, claiming the authorities had no right to interfere with his family's life. "We take care of ours," he repeated, a phrase that would later reveal itself to be loaded with disturbing meaning. Martha, in turn, remained silent, responding only with monosyllables when questioned directly. The children demonstrated a mix of curiosity and fear regarding the visitors, showing their limited contact with people outside the family core. Dr. Hayes performed basic physical examinations on the children and observed several worrying signs. Besides mild malnutrition and a lack of preventive medical care, he noted physical characteristics that might indicate genetic problems consistent with inbreeding. Thomas had polydactyly, an extra finger on his left hand. Sadie had dental development problems, and Jacob presented signs of cognitive impairment more severe than initially perceived. These signs, when observed in isolation, could have several causes, Dr. Hayes explained in his report. But when observed together, added to the shared physical characteristics and the family's isolation, they raised serious concerns about possible consanguinity. The investigation took a more accurate course when the team gained access to the family's few medical records. In 1970, Martha was treated in a hospital in the neighboring county following a domestic accident. The doctor had observed that she was 3 months pregnant. However, there was no record of birth or adoption of any child during that period. A deeper search of records revealed a pattern. Martha had been treated at different hospitals in the region in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years that would approximately correspond to the ages of Thomas, Sadie, and Jacob. On each occasion, she used different names, but the physical descriptions and basic medical data indicated it was the same person. The investigation hit a significant obstacle when Elijah, sensing the direction of events, prevented investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of abuse or severe neglect, the authorities had limited options for intervention. It was at this moment that a crucial witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman who lived about 5 kilometers from the Sheltons' property. She contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed that she was a friend of Edith, Elijah, and Martha's mother, and that she had kept sporadic contact with the family even after their isolation. Edith was always afraid something like this would happen, Sarah said. Harold kept the family isolated, saying the world was corrupt and they could only trust in their own blood. When they died in that fire, I tried to help the kids, but Elijah was already very much like his father, suspicious, hostile. Sarah revealed she had visited the cabin a few times after the parents' death, bringing supplies and offering help. On one of these visits in 1971, she noticed that Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned him about it, Elijah expelled her from the property and forbade her from returning. I should have done something at that time, Sarah lamented, but who would have believed me? And where would those children end up? The system doesn't take good care of our own out here. Sarah's testimony provided important context, but it was not definitive proof. The investigation needed concrete evidence to intervene. A turnaround happened when one of the agents revised Elijah and Martha's birth records and discovered something intriguing. Their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, shared the same surname before marriage. Subsequent investigations revealed they were first cousins. It is not uncommon in isolated communities like this, explained the local historian consulted by the team. In the early decades of the 20th century, many families in mountainous regions lived so isolated that marriages between nearby relatives ended up happening due to a lack of options. In some cases, this became almost a family tradition, justified by beliefs about blood purity. This discovery shed new light on the case. It wasn't just a possible incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but potentially a generational standard of inbreeding that intensified throughout the generations. The team developed a new theory. Elijah and Martha's parents, already cousins, transmitted isolationist beliefs to their children. After the parents' death, the siblings, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas about family and purity, established an incestuous relationship resulting in the birth of 3 children. The investigation hit an obstacle when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on the Shelton property in the early 1970s. This information briefly reinforced the theory that a third person might be involved, perhaps a wife of Elijah who later disappeared. However, subsequent investigations revealed the witness had likely confused the property or the date. The sheriff, John Pearson, in relation to the allegations, started to consider obtaining a court order to collect DNA samples from the children and adults. The legal process, however, would be complicated, especially considering the family's isolation and the lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect justifying such an invasive intervention. "We have to act carefully here," the sheriff argued. "These people have lived this way for generations. For them, this is their normal way of life. If we invade the property without concrete evidence, we might lose any chance of helping these children." The investigation reached an impasse that would last for several months. During that time, the Department of Social Services maintained regular visits to the property, monitoring the children's well-being and gradually trying to build a relationship of trust with the family. The real turnaround in the Shelton case happened in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation started. During one of her routine visits to the property, Margaret Wilson noticed that Jacob, the youngest, had a high fever and was presenting signs of a severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she succeeded in convincing him to allow the child to be taken to the hospital in West Plains, the largest nearby city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist who had been consulted on the case, took the opportunity to perform more deepened exams with the reluctant consent of Elijah, who accompanied his son. The results of Jacob's exams revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually might have gone unnoticed, but together formed a consistent pattern with a high degree of consanguinity. "The genetic markers we are observing here," Dr. Brennan told the research team, "are typical of children born from relationships between first-degree siblings. There is excessive homozygosity for a relationship between cousins, even first-degree cousins." During the 2 weeks of Jacob's hospitalization for pneumonia complications, Martha remained constantly by his side, demonstrating striking maternal care and anxiety. It was during this time that Martha, physically and emotionally exhausted, finally began to open up to Margaret. One night, as Jacob slept under the influence of medicines, Martha shared fragments of her story. She spoke of the growing isolation after their parents' death, how Elijah gradually assumed the family's patriarch role, and how the limits between family roles started to become confused. "We didn't know anyone," Martha confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, to hurt us. We could only trust each other." Although Martha did not explicitly admit to being the children's biological mother in this conversation, her words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, taking extreme care not to break the fragile confidence being established, avoided asking direct questions about paternity, focusing instead on offering emotional support. Meanwhile, the documentary investigation continued. A significant advance happened when researchers located a traveling pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated communities in the Ozark Hills during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller kept detailed daily logs of his visits, including observations on the families he found. In an entry dated June 1969, he described a visit to the Shelton property. "I visited the Shelton family today. Their parents recently died in tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children, Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered spiritual and material assistance but was received with suspicion, especially by the young Elijah. Something in the dynamic between the siblings seemed disturbing to me. Martha looked submissive, almost fearful. I fear that without the moderating influence of their parents, as isolationist as they were, the situation may deteriorate. I intend to return, but I confess I felt powerless." A later entry from April 1971 was even more revealing. "I returned to the Shelton property after almost 2 years. I was prevented from entering by Elijah, who seemed even more hostile and paranoid. From a distance I could see Martha briefly. She appeared to be in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical attention, he was furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening to assault me if I did not leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear some of them are too dark to bear the light of day." Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another crucial event happened when authorities managed to locate medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha was treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed she had been hospitalized in advanced labor and gave birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including breathing problems and a slight cardiac defect. The birth date coincided with Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at the time noted concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and suggested more tests, but Mary Smith left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and the babies stabilized. While Jacob recovered in the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, performed additional examinations, revealing the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by skull, face, hands, and feet malformations. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence increases significantly in cases of close consanguinity. Based on this new evidence, Judge Elenina Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA tests on all Shelton children and adults. The results, obtained in November 1982, were conclusive. Elijah was the biological father, and Martha was the biological mother of all 3 children. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth. If you believe all cases of family abuse deserve to be investigated, no matter how isolated the community. On December 7, 1982, based on the genetic evidence and collected testimonials, Elijah Shelton was formally accused of incest, a Class D crime in Missouri, punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Martha, considered a victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, did not face criminal accusations, but her ability to care for the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial started in February 1983 and attracted significant regional media attention, despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the children's privacy. The Shannon County Court hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by public defender Gerald Thompson, argued that the extreme isolation and dysfunctional environment in which he was raised had compromised his ability to discern basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's parents, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, argued Thompson, is the product of generational isolation and possibly previous inbreeding. He himself is the son of first cousins who raised him to believe the outside world was hostile and the family should remain introspective. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, recognized the attenuating circumstances, but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated the ability to interact with the community when needed, to conduct basic business, and to deliberately hide the true nature of his relationship with his sister, Lewis argued. These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong. Martha Shelton testified behind closed doors. Edited excerpts from her testimony, subsequently disclosed, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation that started after her parents' death, when she was 29 and Elijah 33. According to Martha, Elijah gradually assumed full control over all aspects of their lives, isolating her more and more, and convincing her that the outside world represented a threat to her safety and their family unit. He told us we were special, Martha said, that our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be contaminated by the outside world. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I began to believe. Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social isolation and abusive family dynamics, testified as an expert, explaining to the jury the deep effects of extreme isolation and prolonged indoctrination. What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality built by isolation. When a person is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what is acceptable can be radically distorted. The trial also highlighted the failure of local institutions to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence revealed that concerns had been expressed by at least 3 different people over the years: Reverend Miller, the neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee of the current River Supply store who noticed similarities between the children and the adults who occasionally visited. In no case was there proper follow-up by the authorities, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and protecting vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury considered Elijah Shelton guilty of incest, but recommended leniency due to attenuating circumstances. The judge, Elenina Simmons, sentenced him to 3 years in prison with the possibility of conditional release after 18 months, and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons noted, "This case represents a collective failure, not just of the defendant, who is still responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to be set aside by our protection and support systems." Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment. As for the children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily in state custody, while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, as Martha showed the capacity to properly care for the children and keep them integrated into the community. The children were placed in a foster home in the neighboring county, where they began receiving formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, rapidly reaching his peers in educational terms despite the initial delay. Sadie had more difficulties with social adaptation, but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health problems. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct malformations and started intensive care for his developmental delay. Comprehensive genetic tests revealed all 3 children were carriers of multiple genetic anomalies resulting from inbreeding. Thomas presented mainly smaller problems, like the polydactyly, which had already been surgically corrected, and a predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Sadie presented more significant problems, including a rare enzymatic deficiency that affected her metabolism and required continuous medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from Apert syndrome, among other complications that would require medical care for a lifetime. The Shelton case triggered significant changes in social service policies in Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Law, approved by the State Legislative Assembly in 1985, established more rigorous protocols for monitoring families in isolated areas, including regular visits from social workers and wellness checks for all children, regardless of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton served 22 months of his sentence before being released on conditional freedom in 1985. As a condition for his release, he was prohibited from returning to the family property while the children were under Martha's care and had to undergo continuous therapy and regular supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive therapy, recovered the children's custody in 1984. With state assistance, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains, where the children could continue their studies and medical treatment. She completed her own GED, high school equivalent diploma, and eventually got a job as a library assistant in a local library. The Shelton family's history continued to evolve in the following decades. Thomas, the eldest son, surpassed the adversities of his upbringing and graduated in social work, dedicating his career to helping children in vulnerable situations. Sadie faced more difficulties, fighting chronic health problems and psychological challenges related to her past, but she ended up finding stability as an artist and artisan. Jacob, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, achieved a semi-independent life with community support and became a defender of the rights of people with disabilities in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic study in faculties of social work and law across the country, illustrating the complex intersections between geographic isolation, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failures. It also highlights the physical and psychological effects of inbreeding, not just on the children directly affected, but also on subsequent generations. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, Margaret Wilson, then retired, reflected on the case in an interview with a local newspaper. What's most impressive looking back is how something so extreme could happen practically in sight of everyone. It wasn't a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was less than 30 kilometers from a city, in a county with resources and institutions allegedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes us think how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or in plain sight, hoping someone pays attention. The original Shelton property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin collapsed over time, but the land remains a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate cycles of damage for generations. If you have watched this far, it is because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can know who truly cares about the search for the truth. Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who also value understanding the complexities of human nature and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now to follow more investigations of cases that make us reflect on our society and collective responsibility.